Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. We have Vanessa Priya Daniel. She's worked in social justice movements for 25 years as a labor and community organizer and funder. She founded and served for 17 years as executive director of Groundswell Fund, a leading funder of women of color led grassroots and electoral organizing. She's a recipient of the Smith College Medal, was featured by the Chronicle of Philanthropy as one of 15 influencers who are changing the nonprofit world, and by Inside Philanthropy as one of the top 100 most powerful players in philanthropy. Vanessa has written for the New York Times and other publications, and her new book, available now, is called Unrig the Game: What Women of Color Can Teach Everyone About Winning. Vanessa, it's a pleasure to have you here, and thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. And then so in her book, Vanessa wrote, these are apocalyptic times. No generation has faced stakes this high or a responsibility this large. There is no guarantee that there will be enough time for future generations to accomplish the work we were too afraid to undertake, to be bold where we were timid, to act where we hesitated. All of us who are alive and able to take action today, we are the team on the court. This is our shot, and we can't afford to miss. I think about this daily as I look at my two daughters and feel how much I want them and their children to have clean water to drink, clean air to breathe, and the ability to lead safe and fulfilling lives. I think about this as I reflect on my 25 years working in social justice movements and the gravity of what those movements face today.
Mhm.
Social justice victories are no longer just about who lives well or not. They are about how long human beings as a species will have on the planet on which to survive. And given the outsized role the United States is playing in harming the earth, whether these movements succeed or fail has global implications. No team worth its salt should bench its MVPs, most valuable players, during the final championship game.
Yeah.
So I love that. Wonderful, wonderful writing. So let's just start it out with it. So who are the MVPs?
Yeah, well, the MVPs in this country of social change come in every gender and race and background and walk of life, but there are a large number of them who are women of color leaders. And that's what the book is focused on, is that there are a disproportionate number of women of color in leadership of movement organizations that bring what I call are the three superpowers. And those are things that we can all access and use, and they're very, very critical, particularly in this moment as we are in the fight of our lives against fascism. And the book looks at how much more power our movements could be unlocking if we stopped making leadership positions so treacherous for these folks. So the MVPs are also folks I interviewed for the book. I talked to
Yeah.
almost 50 incredible leaders from across nearly every major social justice movement, from climate justice to, um, you know, uh, abolition
Mhm.
to labor organizations and economic justice organizations to reproductive justice. And so being able to really sit down with everyone from my elders like Dolores Huerta, who folks may remember. Dolores Huerta started the United Farm Workers Union alongside Cesar Chavez,
Mhm.
to incredible national leaders like Linda Sarsour and Ashley Woodard Henderson, Ai-jen Poo, down to these incredible young ones who are organizing on campuses across this country. Was really a masterclass for me. So those are the MVPs whose voices also come through in the book with some really timely advice that can help us all in this moment.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, actually, what made you feel that this was the moment to write Unrig the Game? Like, what brought it on? Yeah.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is that I finished this manuscript before the election.
Wow.
So,
Okay.
that passage you read was probably written about 2 to 3 years before the election.
Hmm.
But I think that what it reflects is the writing that many of us have seen on the wall, and certainly what women of color have been seeing on the wall, living our lives at the intersection of race and class and gender
Mhm.
oppression, is that these are just such apocalyptic times. And so, um, you know, it's interesting that so much of it, people have been seeing, this book is so timely. It feels like it's right on time.
Hmm.
And how did you know? And, I just think that we were seeing the foreshadowing to the moment we're in. And many women of color, particularly folks working at the grassroots, have been warning us about it for a long time. And so I'm hopeful that the superpowers in particular that I talk about in the book can be helpful to us.
Yeah. And what interested me most was honestly your own background. So, can you tell us a little bit about? So, you mentioned being and feeling silenced, some of the trauma that you experienced, what it was like in your community, how, and more or less, do you sort of wish that there was a deeper sense of community at those times for you? So, can you share a little bit about your background and obviously also what sparked your interest in social justice just on the whole?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I grew up a queer mixed race kid. I'm half Sri Lankan and half white in Seattle,
Hmm.
Washington in the 80s and 90s. So, that was the time. It was like the um, birth time of hip hop. It was the birth time of grunge. There wasn't the level of conversation that we have now around race and gender. I mean, I grew up in a time when not a lot of people were out of the closet, particularly young people. So, my experience of watching kind of the sexism that I saw my mother navigate as a single mom, even as a white woman, and seeing the xenophobia and discrimination my immigrant family faced. And then during a large part of my childhood where my Sri Lankan family was not around, it was really Black women who took me under their wing and helped me figure out how to navigate life as a girl of color. And so also seeing what the Black community that I was connected to experienced in this country, all of that shaped me in a number of ways. I mean, I think just really understanding the different forces of oppression and how they come at people, and that we have to um, try to get free of more than one thing at once in
Mm,
order to get free.
mm,
We can't just tackle white supremacy. We can't just tackle patriarchy. We can't just tackle economic injustice or xenophobia. Tackling these things together is really important. It also, the experience of growing up as a kid who was odd. I mean, I was odd because, um, my whole life growing up in Seattle, I was the only Sri Lankan person I ever met who wasn't a member of my family. And then my family
Hmm.
was kind of in and out sporadically. So I really did have that experience of most rooms I walked into, the first question that white folks had was, "Where are you from?" The first question that Black folks had was, "What are you mixed with?"
Hmm.
And so this experience of feeling othered a lot, feeling like I had to explain who I was a lot, feeling like kind of being regarded with a level of maybe suspicion or curiosity or um, exotification or whatever, I think really shaped that, in combination with what I saw people I love experiencing in terms of oppression, really shaped my desire to go into social justice, but also a real commitment to understanding and loving people at the margins of society. So, when I went into organizing, I organized home care workers. I became a community and a labor organizer.
mm,
And then when I became a funder of organizing, I put the groups at the absolute center of our work who are some of the most marginalized. So Black women received the largest share of funding through pretty much every program we ran. Trans folks were in the mission of the organization from the jump.
mm,
So I think this has all shaped my politic and understanding that, you don't really get anywhere through timidity. You get places by being bold and demanding the fullness of what you need.
Hmm. Yeah, and then now I'm also thinking about it in the context of intersectionality. But just before we even get
Mm,
into that, what I like is that you frame trauma in this sort of you take this sort of broad brush of it. And what I mean by that is you look at trauma as personal, and then you also look at the wider kind of consequences of it and what it looks like on a deeper
yeah,
level, on a societal level. So can you talk to us about? I kind of want to kind of stick with your background for a little bit. Can you talk
sure.
to us about kind of when you figured it out, when you were thinking, oh wow, this isn't only me. This is actually happening on a national scale.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I really started figuring that out pretty young, and it was really Black folks who politicized me around that. I mean, I think I was, which also speaks to what is being erased from our schools currently. So I was in second grade when my choir teacher showed us footage of Black folks facing fire hoses and dogs in
Wow.
Birmingham. I was, I think it was that same year that I read my first book on Harriet Tubman. I did my
Mm,
first book report. So, and I just happened to be in a school where there was a Black woman principal, even though it was in a predominantly white area. So I think I started to understand. I mean, we learned about apartheid that was going on in South Africa at the time. I remember getting together with friends and doing like a little fundraiser to, help, send a couple bucks to like go defeat apartheid. So I had this awareness that these things were unfair that were happening. And then I think that just grew as I came up and was able to study more about history. I went to a very progressive high school called the Northwest School, which back in the day it was like in Seattle, it was very grungy, it was very artsy, it was founded by old 60s radicals.
Hmm.
We you know, it was like kind of the school of misfits.
Mm.
Stone Gossard was a graduate of that. I don't know if you all know Pearl Jam.
Mm.
Yeah.
Jason Sellers was in my class, like from the Scissor Sisters. So it
Wow.
was a very kind of counterculture school. And I think, I really valued that they told us the truth. We learned the truth about the atom bomb and Hiroshima. They taught us about Vietnam and like the real of what happened. And that was really important. And I think that's why it's so important to fight for this kind of content and education today. But yeah, I think that's what shaped me. I think I had a sense of it by the time I was a teenager, as like more of a global sense of what was going on.
Yeah, and it seems like solidarity at that point became super important to you. I mean, did you get a sense that, at some point that you weren't able to, in terms of, context here, personal trauma, but did you feel like in terms of the actual personal, there was really, outside of the collective, there were no other means of actually combating it? Meaning that in terms of, again, going back to solidarity, that we needed to collectively get together and defeat it or, combat it, whatever,
Mhm.
because fundamentally it just wasn't something that one individual could really overcome.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think the systems that I was coming up against as a child and like the trauma that I kind of worked through and survived was, being a survivor of sexual abuse and then, being the kid in my family who spoke out about it and being abandoned and being exiled by my entire Sri Lankan family because that was not what you did. And I
Mm.
mean, that is not just a personal thing. That is a systemic result of generations of the way rape culture has created silence and a culture of silence in so many societies around the world. And so, I mean, that is a huge system that needs to get tackled collectively, like the way that it was with Me Too. I mean, that is the only way that you really, by speaking out and by collective action, bringing those things down, as um, as Giselle Pellicott talks about, like shame switching sides. I mean, that requires collective action and support to do. And then, growing up with a white mother who was wonderful in so many ways, but didn't really have the skills in the 1980s or the will to deal with race and to deal with the racism I was facing. Those were systemic things. And it was Black folks who helped me understand like race, this is not just personal insults. These are systemic things that are killing people, are harming millions of people around the planet. And we need to deal with it through collective action and through organizing. And so I got that pretty young. And I think many people come into movement because we've experienced trauma, and our response to it is not to like reify it or recreate it by traumatizing other people, but is sort of this drive to try to tackle and dismantle the systems so that
Yeah.
this trauma can't happen to anyone else. And I think that I'm just one of the, millions of people who have joined the ranks of social justice movements with a real conviction and, what has felt like a calling to me to do that and to try to make the world a place where more people can belong and be safe.
Right.
Mm. And something interesting to me from the book, you name, and we talked about this a little bit earlier
Mhm.
too. You named three superpowers: 360-degree vision,
Mhm.
boldness, and
Mhm.
generosity. I
Yeah.
guess first, can we talk about what those are and what they mean, and then also which one do you think is actually the most underappreciated? I suppose
Mm.
globally. Yeah.
That's a really great question. Well, first to define them, I mean, 360-degree vision is the language that I use to describe an organizing praxis
Mm.
of fighting injustice in a way that tackles forces like patriarchy, white supremacy, extractive capitalism, colonialism, not just one by one, but simultaneously, and understanding like the interplay of those systems and how they support each other, and that we need to get rid of all of them in order to not be harmed. And it is not the concept of intersectionality, of experiencing those forces simultaneously in the way that, for example, women of color do,
Mhm.
is something that Kimberly Crenshaw talked about. She coined that term. The Combahee River Collective talked about it. Shri Moraga wrote about it. So these are not new concepts, but 360 vision is what I really describe as it is like the organizing strategy around that. So, it looks like fighting not just for fair wages, but for racial and gender equity and pay. It looks
Mhm.
like not just fighting for healthcare, but for reproductive and gender affirming healthcare. And women of color have been at the lead in that. Boldness is this radical idea that we can fight for the fullness of what our communities need to actually thrive and be well,
Mhm.
and what the planet needs to be livable. And it is really such an antidote to this affliction of timidity that fascists really rely on to get all of us to obey in advance.
Mhm.
So boldness looks like the squad as the left flank in Congress. It looks like Barbara Lee as the only no vote to the Iraq War. It looks like the sisters who were part of the Green New Deal. We knew that um, a Black woman, Rihanna Gone Right, wrote it. AOC, a Latina, was its first champion in Congress.
Mhm.
Varshini Prakash, a Desi woman, organized youth at the grassroots to push for it. And then when it stalled out, it was Pramila Jayapal, as head of the Congressional Progressive Caucus,
Mhm.
who really picked up the baton and, working with folks at the grassroots and in Congress, made sure that key elements of it made it into the Inflation Reduction Act. So we can see that as we're looking at these fires in LA and all of these climate disasters that continue, that boldness makes a difference, because there's now the largest chunk of resources we've ever seen for addressing climate change in this country now includes a significant portion for the most vulnerable communities.
Mhm.
So that's what boldness looks like. And then generosity is the conviction to fight in a way that doesn't throw any group under the bus in order to win. And this really jams the gears of the kind of divide and conquer and spinelessness that fascism relies on in order to advance. And
Mhm.
there's no shortage of where we're seeing that right now. We can watch what Gavin Newsom is doing, throwing trans kids under the bus in California. We can look at what Schumer is doing. Um, it is, um, it really, when you're in these dark moments, in history, you really see where the backbone is and where it is not. And so that generosity is, saying that we are not going to leave immigrants or our trans kids or pregnant people or anyone behind, and that is actually how we protect all of us.
Mhm.
And we see that over and over again in how women of color show up. Fatima Goss-Graves, who was interviewed for the book, she's the head of the National Women's Law Center. She just went on, publicly, announced, into the media, the National
Mhm.
Women's Law Center will never abandon transgender women. So this kind of stance is just critically important in the time. Um, I think to your question about which one was it the most kind
Like
of
underappreciated. Yeah.
underappreciated? That's a really good question. Um, I think that the boldness, I don't know if I'd use the word underappreciated, but I think that there is a way in which it is either ignored
Mhm.
or it is attacked.
Hmm.
And when you really listen to like an AOC, for example, describe what her experience has been, it is very similar to the experiences of many women of color in movement who are trying to move in a bold direction. My friend Ashley Woodard Henderson says that leadership sometimes often feels like trying to fly a plane while being shot at from all sides.
Hmm.
Mhm.
And, Bell Hooks taught us that sometimes people try to destroy you precisely because they recognize your power, not because they don't see it, but because they see it and they don't want it to exist. And I think
Mm.
that boldness to really drive hard for what we need with how much clock time we have left on the world, which is not that much, um, is is something that if people could truly value that, we would have just such a stronger chance of saving the hope of democracy in this country, saving our planet and our rights.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and sorry, I just have to say this. Yeah, I totally see your point because I thought about it initially. You know what I thought probably the most underappreciated was? I thought it was generosity actually because
Mm,
too many people. This is maybe simplistic,
yeah,
very simplistic, but I'm thinking like a lot of people, really fall prey to that divide and conquer mentality because it
yeah,
is actually from a certain perspective, it is very easy to kind of organize groups into like, okay, us versus them, or like these are the bad people, and or you find somebody to scapegoat,
yeah,
and it feels like you're playing on certain primal instincts that people have in terms of like
yeah,
tribalism to like really get them going.
yeah,
But then when I think about, yeah, but yeah, I see what you mean about boldness. Yeah, like too many people are complacent or they settle for incremental change
yeah,
or they're not, like you said, they're not bold enough, right? Like
yeah,
they'll maybe settle for something, but not really push the real agenda, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think that's right. And I mean, fascism is essentially just the worst of America on steroids. I mean, it's that
Yeah.
three-headed monster of white supremacy, patriarchy, and extractive capitalism. And I think that there are, you can look around the globe and the path to fascism is nearly always paved with the eroded rights of three groups: women, LGBTQ people, and oppressed racial and ethnic minorities.
Hmm.
And, in this country, every single woman of color belongs to at least two of those groups. And those of us who are queer belong to all three, which is a lot of us in movement. So I just think we're under very little illusion that the way through this is to keep our heads down and to follow directions. We are highly motivated to fight. And I think that we see that, when we look at a Jasmine Crockett, when we look at like Bambi Salcedo from Trans
Mhm.
Latina Coalition in LA, just the way people are showing up. And that is something to key off of in these times because the timidity, the idea that we're just going to obey in advance and we're going to sacrifice some people and somehow get through is is not real for the most marginalized groups. And that is the way that fascists advance around the world. And unfortunately, we've just got a lot of people and white men in particular, that is like a highly conditioned response to threat, and we're seeing that. And I think white women, to a lesser extent, but follow pretty closely behind that. So it is a time when, I've been even encouraging folks, um, like white folks in philanthropy who I talk to
Mhm.
quite a bit, like, and philanthropy is like the bastion of spinelessness a lot of the times, even on a good day, where people are doing that. It's like comfort is valued above everything else. But
Mhm.
to really look at like who are the people we're keying off of in these times, like I feel like the only thing that gets deep sixed more than the stories of people of color revolutionaries is the stories of white folks throughout history who actually stood up and did the
Mhm.
right thing. And there were a lot of them. So I'm telling folks, like, go study your history, key off of the Freedom Riders, key off of the people who sheltered people on the Underground Railroad, key off of the folks who, supported the farm workers boycotts and, who have stood up because there's a lot of people. They just have been intentionally erased. So, find them. And those are the people we have to key off of to keep us um, from going off the rails in this moment.
Mm.
Yeah. And I love the concept of not leaving anybody behind. So as you were talking about like Schumer and Newsom, so what I was thinking about as we mentioned trauma earlier. So the kind of I think important and really interesting thing about trauma is oftentimes what happens is the person who is traumatized, essentially they think about harmony and they overvalue harmony because the community overvalues harmony. So there's always this sense of like so let me just kind of get into the politics about this a little bit. So there's like let's say if you look at a Bill Maher or whomever, he might say, well, we have to make concessions because at the end of the day, we have an entire country to think about, and certain people are not going to vote our way, which is obviously understandable. But the notion of not leaving anybody behind is actually re-traumatizing for a lot of people, and that's the thing that people don't get. So for the most part, and Vanessa, I'm sure you have an extensive insight into this, is that when you're thinking about trauma, the thinking is how do I make sure that the other people in my community feel safe and feel comfortable, right? How do I make sure that I'm not a burden to them? This comes up a lot in mental health. So how do I make sure that everybody's fine as opposed to me, right? I'm the one who's going to sacrifice myself for the greater good. And so what we want to do as Democrats, as liberals, as progressives, whatever label you want to take, we want to actually make sure that these people who are already burdened by trauma don't take on the excessive burden of being cast aside for the greater good. So when you have progressives like, I don't know if he'd call himself that, but like a Bill Maher or whomever, so when they say something like, sorry, we just have to do this because, like this is the real world, right? That's a thought that comes up over and over again. This is the real world. Well, the problem is, okay, great. Yeah, you're right. And we might win more elections. I don't doubt that. But then when you look back on the Clinton years and then you go back even further than that, times weren't so great for a lot of people. So when you're saying, well, hey, it's better to win elections as opposed to losing them, I don't necessarily disagree. But what are we sacrificing for that? So I think for a lot of these folks, maybe this is an uncharitable interpretation, but I do think it is more or less accurate. I think the thinking is, well, I'm a Democrat, I'm a liberal, so I want to win elections. We'll figure that out later. My point is to say when it does come to somebody who's traumatized and cast aside, sometimes there really is no later.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I also think even if you're completely callous and self-interested and don't care about the most marginalized person, there is absolutely no evidence that throwing other people under the bus is a strategy to keep for Bill Maher to keep himself safe.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? Like
Mm.
this is because that has been the prevailing approach of many liberals and of the Democratic Party as a whole, with the exceptions, of course, of, a few of its members who are actually, as AOC would describe, brawlers for justice. But I mean, I think the Democratic Party brand, has become synonymous with very middle of the road strategies that are sacrificing a whole lot of people. I came up in the reproductive rights movement. It
Mm.
wasn't until very, very recently that the Democratic Party as an institution was saying much of anything about that. Most of the time, it was like abortion was the issue that people treated like the electric third rail that no one wanted to touch. Um, you know, white supremacy. I mean, the Democratic Party wasn't in the lead on addressing police brutality until we had the largest protest movement in the history of this country after the murder of George Floyd. So it's
Mm.
the grassroots organizing that leads things, not the Democratic Party. But I would just ask anyone, I would ask a Bill Maher, okay, Bill Maher, this strategy of we have to compromise and sacrifice some people and drive towards the middle, we've been doing that for decades. So how's that working out for you? How's that
Yeah.
working out for us?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it is the definition of insanity to continue to try the same approach and expect different results. It's not functioning. It has delivered to us a Trump. And the people who have throughout this been saying, be bold, take a stand, um, you know, we have ignored them at our own peril. And it is them who, in the moments when we have one, have helped us, you know, to not go over the cliff, by the skin of our teeth. It was in 2020, it was not white men like Bill Maher who were leading the way. They were leading the way in overwhelming majority towards Trump, towards
Mm.
concessions, towards throwing people under the bus,
Yeah.
followed closely by white women who were still voting in majority for Trump. And if you look at Black women on the other end of the spectrum, voting, 93, 92% this last election against Trump, that is a stunning level of moral and political clarity. And, if if more people were moving from that, we could all be enjoying more rights. So I think um, we have to like create some new heroes and some more models too of like what it can look like, um, what it really looks like to understand interdependence. And, sometimes I tell this story of this guy, Roger McAfee, who was a white dairy farmer from Oregon.
Mm.
And when Angela Davis was incarcerated, they were trying to figure out who could post bail for her if the judge granted bail. And there were two people who agreed to put it up. One was Aretha Franklin, the Queen of Soul, and the other was this guy, Roger McAfee, this sort of unknown dairy farmer. And it turned out that he ended up being the one that posted the bail. And he got a lot of backlash. He had to post guards around his dairy farm. He had to pull his kids out of school because he lived in this rural, very conservative community. But when they asked him, why did you do it? He said, because he understood that the freedom of Angela Davis and Black children was also about his freedom and the freedom of his children. So we have to start to get that. And, I think this is deep in our society, but it's also deep in the evolution. If we want to get really esoteric, human beings as a species had some bugs in the original operating system. And we
Yeah.
can't keep trying to win justice using that same operating system. We have to actually upgrade because this kind of division, whether it's caste in India or race here or religion somewhere else,
Mm.
um, has been destroying us as a species.
Yeah, and what I love so much, another thing I love so much, is that this is one of the few times in life, in my personal opinion, obviously, is that where it really is black and white or all or nothing. And so when you think about us as just when you think about just like how interdependent we are and how much like nothing that anybody does is sort of in isolation, the fact is that fundamentally that everything is in this like big sort of causal system. And if you don't need to look any further than just like MAGA itself, because fundamentally, I mean, the sycophants all fall by the wayside. So if you just look at Trump's first term and you're thinking like, oh, okay, well, if I kind of like kiss his ass, he's going to be loyal to me. That's so far from the truth. Forget about Democrats, right? So Democrats, I mean, he'll just toss them off the bus whenever he can. But even his own party, his own members, he'll kick them off all the time. And then so you look at just like the administration and the high turnover rate there and just what they do to each other in social media spheres. I mean, it's like you can't even tell who's loyal to whom anymore. And so again, going back to this system, and this is what I now really want to get into, but getting back into the system of these causal and these interconnected, let's say, spheres and these elements. So now I want to ask you, Vanessa, can you actually now tell us and define intersectionality and how each of these elements interacts with and creates the system together?
Mm. Well, I mean, if we think about patriarchy and white supremacy and economic injustice or extractive capitalism, we can look at the suppression of women's wages. We can look at the fact that domestic work, which was initially done almost exclusively by Black women, and that was why domestic workers were excluded from the labor protections that were won in the early 20th century, that were won and established for every other type of worker, was to keep a certain underclass um, of folks who could provide cheap or free labor that would enable certain people to accumulate wealth. So we see the interlocking way that patriarchy and white supremacy and then extractive capitalism works to make a few people rich. We also can see how it interlocks in what W.E.B. Du Bois used to call like the psychological wage.
Mm.
So, for example, this country is the only industrialized country in the world that doesn't have universal healthcare.
Mhm.
Why don't we have that? Because rich white men were able to convince poor white folks that to agree to that would be giving a handout to Black and brown people.
Wow.
And the reason that that's so convincing, to the point where you have poor white folks who are literally foreclosing on their homes because they can't pay their medical bills, but still voting down universal health care, because there's a psychological wage that actually becomes, it is a psychosis in this country. Toni Morrison talks about it, about, you know, that you need, in order to feel better in yourself, you actually need to feel that you are higher than someone else.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is that feeling that, well, instead of criticizing a Trump, it's like, well, maybe one day I could be Trump. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe one thing that makes me closer to being Trump is that I can feel higher and better and superior to these other folks, be they women, be they people of color, be they trans folks. And then there's also the element of getting folks to fear people, and to then it's like the scapegoating comes in as well. Well, now my economic problems, again, intersectionality of race and class and xenophobia and all of these things. Now my economic pain is not because corporate bosses are stealing my wages, which is what actually is happening, but it's caused somehow by trans people using bathrooms and trans kids playing sports and immigrants, um, taking jobs, which, by the way, most folks aren't volunteering to do.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, we see the way that all of these systems interact, not only in a material sense, but in a psychological sense, to keep us divided from each other. And when you look at the moments in history when people have gotten wise to that and started coming together, that is the moment when there's the most vicious attack on movements. So it was when, not after the March on Washington, but it was after Dr. King had organized the sanitation markers march on Washington, that it was actually bringing together um, poor people
Mm-hmm.
across race, across racial categorizations, across gender, to march in a unified way. That is when they were like, we got to take this person out. This is too dangerous. This is too much a threat to the accumulation of wealth of people at the top. So, I think these are how some of these systems interlock and work together, and why we need to, and why solidarity is the way, and understanding how to dismantle them simultaneously is actually the way that we all get free and the largest number of people get free.
Yeah. And just curious then, so in terms of actually interacting with people, because a lot of what you're saying is definitely wonderful, but it's really complicated. And when you're thinking about, let's say, the average voter, for a lot of them, they are looking, and this is why MAGA, I think, is so influential. They are looking for simplistic notions. So how would you say for somebody, let's say on our end, for like a podcaster, writers, whomever, how can we actually effectively communicate the message to voters in a way that's sort of, let's say, palatable to them?
Yeah. Well, what I would say is this. I would say, first of all, we need to stop treating voters like they're stupid.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really important. And I think we need to give people credit for some of the things they are doing and really notice what is appealing to them. So, for example, you can look around the country and see that people voted overwhelmingly for things like living wage. They voted overwhelmingly for abortion access, even for
Mm-hmm.
LGBT rights, where they were ballot initiatives. They voted for people like AOC and Ilhan Omar and
Mm-hmm.
a lot of folks who are very progressive, who they see as fighters for them. Where they divested was from the Democratic brand, because they don't feel like that is a brand that is fighting like hell for them. And they're not wrong about that. When you see the party um, welcoming fascists into the White House with a customary tea ceremony, because that's the way it's always been done. I mean, this is emblematic of the stance that we see from Schumer, that we see from Newsom, where working people of all races recognize this as lacking in integrity and backbone and fight. And people are hurting right now. They're hurting economically. They're hurting from climate disasters. They deserve people who are going to fight like hell for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, it is important to support that. The Working Families Party is putting forth a lot of candidates, and I think a vision that is much more direct in fighting for working people. And, I think that when you talk to people, just as on the level of the things that they care about, the childcare that is costing them too much, the housing costs that they're dealing with, and give them solutions to that, then that becomes a lot easier to understand these terms. Intersectionality is a big word, but the fact is that, as Audre Lorde said, none of us live single issue lives. So everybody can understand this in a very real way, just in the context of their own lives. You can take, the average person and say, look, you're a woman of color, you're a single mom, you're struggling in a state where, you can see how patriarchy is manifesting because you don't have access to abortion services. You can see how it's manifesting because you're making 60 cents on the dollar. You can see how it's manifesting in, the way that you may be abused or battered and not able to get the support that you need. And you can see the economics of how that all of that is figuring into your ability to support and sustain yourself when you can't control your reproduction and you can barely feed the kids that you have, and you want to be able to access, control and self-determination over your body, or you want to be able to be paid your worth. Um, People understand this in the context of their paychecks, in the context of their ability to have bodily autonomy. And they understand it in the context of people they love. Most people have a queer or trans folks in their lives,
Mhm.
who are their loved ones. And they may have their own religious views or whatever about it, but they love their family members and they don't want to see them hurt. They don't want to see them killed. So, I think that these are not actually complex notions when we break it down into just the daily lives that we're all living.
Yeah.
And so I kind of have a lot of questions almost in one question, but I feel like I have to ask this. So, uh, in a lot of ways, we've kind of outlined what does it look like when a movement, truly kind of protects the people within that movement. We kind of talked about, the superpowers, that sort of thing. I wanted to ask, like, if somebody, let's say, was deciding, I actually, they listen to this podcast, they listen to your other interviews, or they get inspiration from somewhere else. They want to start to become an activist, let's say, right? What are some things that I suppose one could look for that are signs of like a truly like they're in the right movement, or the people around them in that
Mm.
movement are um, proper allies, or what are the things they have to look out for, or are there any cautionary tales maybe you could not cautionary tales, I guess, um, what what should people look out for? Yeah, I'll just put it that way.
Like when they're trying to engage and get involved.
Yeah, yeah. Like, what are the good things? What are the bad things they should sort of look out for to be sort of kind of prepared? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the number one thing people should look out for is organizations that are using grassroots organizing as a primary approach to social change.
Mhm.
Grassroots organizing is where you are engaging people from local communities, getting them together to have meetings, to really listen deeply to what the community cares about and wants, and then helping people to identify the targets that can deliver to them their demands, and then to use collective action to pressure those targets to win those demands. And it can start small. It can be anything from, a stop sign in a community to fighting for, a citywide municipal resolution to protect trans kids, to fighting for, a group of workers to be able to have safety on the job. But, people getting involved in their communities. And I think that when you find places like, there are People's Action affiliates around the country. For example, there's the Working Families Party. Um, there are local organizations. I just came from Los Angeles, like Black Women for Wellness, that's doing this just in an incredible way. And then when you get into these spaces, really look for whether you see issues being tackled with a lens that looks to race, class, and gender. So, for
Hmm.
example, in Oregon, there was a fight for, um, they were fighting for abortion rights, and there was a Reproductive Health Equity Act that was on the ballot. And the way the people at that table approached it was to say, this is going to provide access to full spectrum reproductive health care, but it should exist for everyone. So we're not actually going to walk away from this table unless, or we're going to walk away from this table unless undocumented people and trans folks are included in this.
Hmm.
So when you see people moving in that way, and they won that, by the way, and
Hmm.
they won that because when they included those communities, it brought the full force of the immigrant rights movement and the LGBT rights movement to bear, not just the reproductive rights movement. Um, and they were able to defend it quite successfully because of that as well. When you see things like that, you know that you're in a spot where um, there are people who are not throwing folks under the bus.
Hmm.
And, so I think that people can look for that in organizations, and they can also look for organizations that do that kind of work from a place of grace and love and not from self-righteousness. We have a lot of self-righteousness happening in movement right now. Um, you know, Ordinary people don't want to go into spend their free time in a space. They're already stressed out. They're already probably working two or three jobs. They don't want to go into some place where they're going to get um, humiliated and publicly shamed for saying the wrong thing or making some small mistake. So
Hmm.
really looking for organizations where um, it's not negligent, where people are allowed to be racist or transphobic, without any intervention, but it's also not punitive, where people are just kind of performing wokeness on each other by trying to dominate each other and feel higher by putting other people down. And I think that looking for those kind of environments and being interested in creating those kind of environments, we have to love people where they're at and meet them where they're at. And the truth is, none of us were as woke as we are now, to even 10 years ago or 5 years ago. We're all learning. So we have to have rigor, but also grace with
Hmm.
each other around our learning curve. So that's what I would tell people to look for. And, the book is full of examples of organizations and leaders who are operating in that way. So it's a good treasure trove for folks to look through and find the folks who are maybe near them, near where they live.
Mm.
And something I know you wanted to ask something,
Mhm.
but I
Go
want to
for it.
follow this up. So a lot of, I mean, I- sorry, I can't say this for sure, but I get the feeling like a lot of people, uh, who let's say aren't currently activists, right? But who have thought about it. Like, how would they approach this? How
Yeah.
would they get into it? Or they even have maybe they're operating under maybe the thought or maybe illusion that
Hmm.
maybe they're too busy. Like, oh, I'm a parent. I
Yeah.
can't, I don't have time for this. I do work. And then after that, you know, I'm with the kids and then I'm just too tired,
Hmm.
Or maybe someone else doesn't even have kids. They're just thinking, like I really don't have time for this. How am I going to do this? What would you say from your experience, also as a parent, but also as an activist? Like, how did you balance that? And I feel like that's going to help a lot of people to think about, even in the context of other things that they think are keeping them from doing
Yeah.
this sort of work.
Well, I think there's a place for everyone in movement, and I don't think that that means everybody has to be playing the same role or using
Right.
the same tactic or making the same level of commitment. I mean, there's some people who the level of commitment they've made is they've risked their lives are at risk and their lives are being threatened, and they have made peace with that because of the how visible they are. There are other people who, you know, the way that they are supporting their community is, they're very stretched thin because they have raising kids, they're taking
Mhm.
care of elders, they're part of their church community or whatever it is. They're helping people in a lot of ways. But what I would say to people is just think about a way that they can participate in systemic change, because there's a lot of ways in our community where we help people out with downstream support. That means that after they're already in crisis, we help fundraise for them, to pay their medical bills or to keep from foreclosing on their house. We're helping our communities like that, which is an act of love and mutual aid, and we should do all of that. But we can never when you're running a food bank, if you fail to ever ask why people are hungry, then you're not using your energy most efficiently.
Mm,
Because at the end of the day, there is enough resources and abundance in food on this planet for everybody to have enough. So what's breaking down is systems that are not sharing. And so we
mm,
can each play a role in, even as we're giving in these other ways, put some effort into changing the systems to make them more fair and equitable so that we don't have to pull people out downstream. So I would tell people, for some people, it is getting involved and just making sure that you vote and you tell everybody around you to vote and educate them on, the progressive positions and candidates that are going to support our communities. For other people, it's choose an issue that you're passionate about. Maybe it's because you have a loved one who is an undocumented immigrant or a trans person. Get
mm,
involved with a local community organization that is working for systems change and volunteer to whatever extent that you can. Um, it is a horrible feeling for so many of us right now, just like the feeling in the world. But what I will say for myself as a parent is that I feel so much better in my soul when I'm able to do something about it. And know that, when my kids are older, I'm going to be able to say to them that I did everything that I possibly could to fight for them to have a future.
mm,
And I think that every parent wants to be able to say that to their kid. And there's nothing worse feeling in our soul than feeling helpless and like this stuff is happening in the news and it's so traumatizing. And like we accept this feeling of powerlessness that we can't
mm,
do anything about it. Um, you know, we always have power. Every single one of us always has power. And the minute that we forget that, the fascists have won. So
mm,
that is how we keep our souls intact. That is how we keep our spirits alive, is by remembering that we always have power and by exercising it in some way that makes sense for us in our lives, to change systems for the better so that we can, be good ancestors.
mm,
One day be good ancestors.
I love it. And why I admire you specifically so much is because I feel like in a lot of just movements in general, you don't really get this. So you have this sort of perfect blend, this harmony, so to speak, of let's say on the one hand, there's a self kind of analytical and just in terms of the actual movement, the party, whatever you want to call it. There's this an extremely critical stance of it, which I love. And I really want to ask about in terms of, the aspects of feminism that don't necessarily work too well, the aspects of even socialism on the whole that don't necessarily work too well. But it's also balanced out with an extreme form of forgiveness too, where you're pretty critical of cancel culture as well. And I think the understanding here is that there's no real such thing as a human who's, I guess, I don't know, for lack of a better term, kind of irredeemable, right? So yeah, so can you actually tell us about this? So first, I want to know in terms of like what you find to be the actual, let's say, components of these movements that you do find to be worthy of criticism, and also why in your heart, in your mind, you feel like in many ways all of us or most of us are capable and worthy of forgiveness.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting when I came into movement in the late 90s and early 2000s, we were at one extreme, and now I feel like we've swung to another, and neither one of them were healthy.
Yeah.
So we went from this over focus on the external, where the internal workplace in movement organizations was really unhealthy. I mean, I came up in labor. We were all working 80 hours a week. I was just reminiscing with a friend of mine from SCIU who I saw in LA last week, how we used to drive home. There were some of us who slept under their desks. One of
wow.
my colleagues slept under his desk. I'd wake him up every morning, but I was like determined to always go home. And I would, drive home and keep, like, blast heavy metal, and it was like the dead of winter, and like have the windows open and then just like drink water or eat something to like stay awake because it was so dangerous. Like all of us were doing this because we were working so many hours and just going home to sleep for like 3 or 4 hours and then driving back to work to start again. So like those kinds of environments, that was not good. But we've swung to this other extreme now where there's this sort of neoliberal, individualistic, navel gazing, where then this over focus on being completely comfortable in the little bubble of your movement organization. and then to where the external work is atrophying because you're like, we can't actually do the external work until we're completely perfect and we don't have any ouches or triggers within this little bubble. And that is an overcorrection, right?
Mhm.
So, and we went from having a lot of discrimination that was really rampant when I came into movement to now discrimination, like false accusations of transphobia, xenophobia, anti-Blackness being used as these cheap tools to carry out vendettas against people. We went from not having any health insurance to people expecting organizations to deliver them complete healing from their trauma.
Oh.
Like these are not real things. And so what I appreciate about the leadership of many women of color is that we're not trying to get back to the good old days because those days were never good for us. But what's happening now is killing us because if you were already under expectations to mother and mammy people, which women of color in leadership have been under for, throughout time. And there's now this added pressure to create a utopian work environment. That is a crushing weight. So we are really trying to get back to, a core place, which means exactly as you said, there is grace, but there's also healthy boundaries and rigor. So we're not going to let the racist uncle carry on, at the dinner party and continue to damage people and go unchecked, but nor are we going to ream the well-meaning elder who just forgot a pronoun and needed a gentle correction. So we're going to understand, what does love look like? Some of the things that we need to let go, and I think love looks like letting some things go that are dysfunctional in movement, drawing some boundaries with some things that are harmful in movement, is, for example, the conflation of all rigor with exploitation,
Hmm.
the conflation of all positional power with abuse, of all discomfort with being harmed.
Hmm.
This kind of overcorrection is making us sloppy, it's making us unstrategic, and we need to cut it out. The seeding of things like excellence and timeliness and any urgency into the domain of white supremacy culture is some of the most ridiculous shit I've ever heard. I'm just like, it's so maddening, and it's just such a disrespect to these long histories of Black and brown excellence that have existed in our movements forever. They have never been about the white gaze. They have always been about delivering excellence for our communities. And
Mhm.
so when you hear these stories of women of color leaders, being, you know, attacked by staff for asking them to show up to work on time, for asking them to copy edit documents, with correct grammar, because this is white supremacy, for people who are in electoral work, for asking folks to, be able to work some long hours on election week. I mean, this is kind of an experience that's losing the plot of how serious it is outside
Mhm.
and just kind of creating this other weaponization in order to put comfort at the front instead of the accountability to our communities. So I think we're seeing, there is a lot of that. I've seen, I talk about the Karens of movement who are equal opportunity Karens. They come in every race and color and gender. And, they want fighting fascism to be more comfy. And they want a lot of credit for having built something, even though the only thing they've built is a pile of complaints. And I think
Mhm.
we need to be real about folks who are coming into movement space like that. We have made the jobs better. The pay is better. They are going to attract a wider set of people, some of whom are narcissistic, some of whom are very neoliberal. I realized this was happening for the first time when someone I hired came into my office 2 weeks after getting a job and said, I'm going to need to change my title because my life coach has told me it's not doing great things for my brand.
Wow.
It's like, what's happening right now? Like our ancestors had crosses burned on their lawns and bombs thrown through their windows. Like, what is the conversation that we're having right now? So I think we need to understand that, there are some people who are genuinely fighting for the right to be excellent in a workplace that is sustainable,
Mhm.
and we should support them. And there are some people who are fighting for the right to be mediocre and destructive in a workplace that has no accountability for them. And I think that we need to reject that, and we need to stop pretending that these things are the same.
Yeah. Yeah. Why I love this so much, man, is, and I really wish, and not just saying this because it's our podcast, but I really wish that this could get such a wide viewing. And the reason why I say that is because like we're left with like the simplistic version of politics where you have like the far left and then you have the far right and then you have the middle ground where these are the cold, sober intellectuals, right? Like the Bill Maher's of the world, where it's like, well, you know, you guys are the children and let the adults kind of take over. But my
Yeah.
God, man, I would say this version for me personally, again, this version of
No, me too, actually.
right. It makes the
Yeah.
most sense.
I love
I'm
it.
like, why can't I'm like this is it, right? So you get this sort of bastardization of the left, that you know, just socialist movements, whatever, where the understanding is, oh, they just hate billionaires and it's extreme, and you know, they kind of just want a free for all, just like the far right. Like again, these are the crazy ones, and it's the moderates who are the intellectuals. But my
Yeah.
God, man, no, this is the version of liberalism that makes the most sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we gotta create it. We gotta like have some muscle control to get to offer to people and get ourselves there.
Yeah.
So I just before we do end, I actually do want to end it on a little bit of a happier, or I
Yeah.
guess what's the word? Yeah, I guess a happier note. So since you mentioned hip hop and your favorite musicians, I am curious, who are some of the hip hop artists that inspired you, especially back in the 90s?
Oh gosh. Well, I mean, I was gonna say right now, Kendrick Lamar, of course.
Mhm.
Oh, back in the 90s, I loved all the female hip hop artists. So Queen Latifah, MC Light. Yeah, I mean, Bahamadia.
Mhm.
Nice.
Yes.
Yeah.
So pretty much people with a social message.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, and I grew up with Tupac. I grew up
Mm.
with, like Public Enemy and NWA and KRS-One, and the message oscillated in those spaces. But yeah, I mean, I really do love that the original place of hip hop as like a protest music, and what it expressed. And yeah, I enjoy the ways that tradition is being continued in some places.
I love it. I love that answer. Okay, so Alan, as we wrap up, final questions.
Yes. If we wanted to follow you, follow your work, and of course buy the book, where can we do that?
Yes, so vanessapriadaniel.com has everything about events. I've still got 3 events in the Pacific Northwest for folks who may be listening from there. There's also information there about how to buy the book, and Instagram at Vanessa Priya Daniel.
I love it. Vanessa, thank you so much for
This
coming
is
Thank
on.
you
This
all
awesome.
was
so much.
excellent.
Appreciate it. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Take good care.
Absolutely. All right, see
You
you.
too.
Talk to you soon.
Same.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
All right, awesome. Okay, so everyone, once again, if you'd like to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On X, we're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe,
Hit the bell on YouTube.
YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.